Hello and welcome to the Not My Job Pod. Today we are joined by the wonderful Martin Hergert, who is currently running for the Berlin Senate. I'm super excited to have my first political guest. Though, as we were just talking, Martin is not your typical politician in the sense that he's not been politically involved for a very long time, but that's kind of special to what Volt is as a party. So I'm really excited to dig into everything about you, Martin, and then talk as well about the party that you've joined and why it's important to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Emily. My name is Martin. I'm 40 years old. I'm sort of coming from business. I worked in a consulting company for many years. Now I'm self-employed. And I joined a political party for the first time 2 years ago, or 3 years ago in 2023. I think Berlin has amazing potential and it's consistently not using all the opportunities that there are. It's a little bit provincial. If you talk to German politicians and especially to Berlin politicians, they're okay with being administrators. I think Berlin needs a vision. What does it want to be in 10 or 15 years? And I think Volt can be a part of the answer. And that's why I decided to run for state parliament. So for those listeners who don't know, Berlin is both a city and a state. And we have elections in September for both the state level and sort of the local level, which are the 12 districts in Berlin. And I'd be happy to join parliament and instead of sort of consulting people on what to do, like be on the table and actually be there when decisions are made.
Very nice. So I do think your background is quite interesting because you have a company and now this political campaign plus the consulting background. So kind of
Yeah.
what was the thread connecting all of this?
I have a degree in business. It's a kind of common thing to study in BWL, sort of business and management in Germany. And then I had an MBA later on from an American university. And that was really a big step in life because suddenly you didn't have to kind of study something and write big fat hour-long exams, but suddenly you had like group work and I had to produce something on day one with people from, in my group, there were people from China, Bulgaria, Mexico, Hungary, Canada, and me or something in one little room. And that was exciting. I learned a lot like how to work with people because in the end, yeah, people are so different from each other. And that's the first sort of connection to politics. You have to have an opinion. You have to have a sort of a base where you're coming from. What's your values? What do you want to achieve? You have the intellectual part, okay, thinking through a problem, finding solutions that might work. But then you also have to work with people and kind of integrate many different perspectives. And especially in Berlin, since it's not so homogeneous. Yes, you have typical things like, I don't know, rich and poor, whatever, district A, district B. But you also have actually people who live in Berlin their whole life. You have people who moved here, from other parts of Germany, and you have the international community, and it's huge. Berlin has around, 4 million people and around 1 million people who are not allowed to vote because they're somehow not Germans or not only Germans. And that's crazy.
And for listeners who have never heard of Volt, when I think of Volt, I kind of think of this almost what you've described in the sense that it's looking at business practices and how to make things efficient, and then trying to apply that to politics. So I'm curious, as well as like the international angle on making things work
Yeah.
for local people while also being inclusive of international cultures and ideas and just a wider array of opinions. So how would you explain, like if you were at a dinner party or something, and how would you explain Volt in just a very short kind of
Yeah.
what is this party? Because you
Yeah,
are one
yeah.
of the
What is this about? Yeah, I mean, we
yeah.
always say it's a political party and a European movement. I think we have chapters in 30 countries, including some who are not yet EU members, like Switzerland, for example. And of course, we have then registered as political parties. Typically, you need to do that in every country. And Volt is, I think, the first party that really thinks from the European level and says, hey, these are our common values, these are some common goals, and all the national chapters have to agree with this. That's very different from most parties who are like focused on the national level and then in the European Parliament they somehow work together. We have a common program across Europe. Of course, solutions can be different, in each country or each city, but sort of the basic values, the fundamental pillars must be the same in each chapter. And those five are sort of a smart state, meaning digitalization, making the state actually work for people. Economic renaissance, we think you have to have economic growth. You have to have some cake, grown before you can distribute it. But then third, social equality, like nobody should be left behind. And that's it's big on many people's minds, but it's even worse in some smaller and some more southern members of the European Union. Yeah, the rich-poor divide, we talk a lot about it in Germany. Germany, it's even worse. And I have a lot of friends who came from Spain or from Portugal because they said, well, I have a master's degree. I want to earn more than minimum wage, and I can't do that in Portugal. So I moved to Berlin. And that should not be the long term solution. Yeah. Moving to the north. You actually have to work on some social equality and some education and on economic chances in the south as well. Our fourth pillar is global balance, meaning we are responsible for what happens in the world. We can't change everything overnight, but working conditions in Bangladesh, yes, we are partly responsible for what we are importing and how we supervise what the European companies are doing in the world. And the fifth one is citizen empowerment. It doesn't mean everything is done bottom up. Yeah, you need to elect leaders. Sometimes you need to take a top down decision. But we think elections is not the only way how to participate. There are many ways how to participate in society. One of them, of course, is this popular votes like in Switzerland. But another one is, for example, citizens' budgets, yeah, where one little neighborhood gets a couple of 10,000 and can decide, which playground to repair or what to do in their little district of the town. And then there's a plus one. We love Europe, but the EU needs reform. And thing that you might have seen is our sort of United States of Europe campaign, saying, hey, okay, we don't want to become the US. We want to become the United States of Europe. Some stuff has to be decided on the European level, and especially some things around foreign policy cannot be blocked by one little country forever. We need some sort of qualified majority and get rid of the veto on the European level. And from these 5+1, most of the things that we do in each country hopefully flow.
Interesting. So when you were kind of getting into politics for yourself, it sounds like you were influenced obviously by your own international experiences and meeting
Yes.
people from multiple countries. And then you yourself are German. So I'm curious, how did you decide to go into more of a local style of government instead of, working at like the EU level, or, was that a decision you made or you just fell into it?
It's a good question. To be super honest, part of it is chance because the next European elections are in 3 years, and the next
Mhm.
Berlin elections are in half a year. So part of it is just chance. Now is the time to get engaged. The other part is that I was a little bit frustrated with Berlin. I moved to Berlin in 2019. Everything in my life was new, like a new job, a new city, a new country. I was living abroad for 10 years, so back to Germany, to Berlin, to a new stop at the startup scene. I got married the same year. So everything was hopeful. And then I ran against the sort of barriers in Berlin constantly. It's like from, my wife's sort of immigration papers to how we can, as a startup, hire some people from a non-EU country, to like literally not getting an appointment, to just change my address. All these kind of little frustrations that people have, I experienced them as well. And that was one of the reasons to say, wait a minute, that must be better. That cannot be blamed on, politics is complicated. Politics is complicated. Compromises take time, but I'm paying a lot of taxes. So please make some, citizen services available to me, and don't tell me there's no appointment in the next 3 months and go home. And
I
frustration brings people to act.
Yeah, I find this super interesting too, because I think literally what you just said is exactly what I think a lot of immigrants are often saying. We couldn't get an appointment and we couldn't do this, and those sort of like bureaucratic barriers. So it is quite interesting to me that you as a German were also facing
No,
the same issues when
absolutely.
you moved here. Yeah. I'm curious though, obviously, I think as we get older, our politics change over time just based on our lived experiences as well. So, in addition to kind of the experience of moving to Berlin, even as a German, though you said, obviously your wife had to deal with immigration papers. So, how did your living abroad experiences change your politics, or did it? Spending the last 10 years, well, pre 2019 abroad.
Good question. I think living abroad showed me a little bit, what's good about Germany. It shouldn't sound cheesy, but I was working in Poland a lot. I was living in Hungary. I was also working 2 years in Saudi Arabia. And these are places where, people told me, well, Germany is so great. We have much bigger problems. They have distinctly sort of members of government who just speak to the camera and say, I want to get rid of democracy. I want to decide myself. And I'm stealing EU money and you can do nothing about it. Yeah. Who are so cocky about like wanting to destroy democracy, or at least, yeah, since after they've been elected, then they don't care anymore. And, this sort of institutional stability that Germany has is something I came, to value more. When I was younger, I was more impatient and thought, oh my God, everybody in government is slow and lazy. And now I know a little bit that slow and lazy is a consequence of institutional stability. The second thing that was sharpened in my mind is how much rights we take for granted that actually not everybody can enjoy. Maybe you've heard the debate about abortions being practically banned in Poland and that being really a big trouble for a lot of women. Maybe you heard about media being sort of not outright censored, but just sort of bought up by the chums of government in Hungary, and suddenly you don't have any sort of variety of opinions anymore. Nobody is formally censoring, but if all big media companies and all the local papers are owned by three guys, then they can of course give the government a much bigger voice than the opposition. How fragile democracy is, how easily it can be destroyed. That's something I've learned in the last 10, 15 years. Like every generation has to work on it anew. It's not given just because it's written somewhere in the constitution doesn't mean it's there forever. Like we have to get involved on whatever level and defend it.
Definitely. And I think that, yeah, to take it a step further, that's still true in, the United States, that's still true in Germany.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a system of checks and balances for sure, but sometimes, I don't know, lately, just especially talking about the US, but even increasingly in Germany, I'm like, oh man, are those checks and balances going to hold? And it starts to make me a bit nervous. So,
Yeah, I'm hoping. I mean, one tiny little example where it might have helped. Yeah, there was a big debate the last, let's say, 4 weeks. The national government in Germany was reviewing some laws around energy policy and, will we build more gas-fired stations or not? How exactly will we regulate like very complicated things in the grid? And a lot of people criticized the economic minister and said, this is not well thought through, and it should be different and so on. You know, a lot of people panicked and said, "Oh my God, Germany is turning their back on green energy and on their international commitments to climate, to prevent or limit climate change and so on." And in the end, it was the Bundesrat, so the upper house comprised of representatives of the 16 states, who said, no, we won't say yes to this law because it has like grave flaws. Please, economic ministry on the federal level, go back and rewrite it. So sometimes they do work in our favor because it was in my opinion, like not very well thought through proposal.
okay. So you're still an optimist then. I guess you have to be if
I
you're.
need to be an optimist. I need to be an optimist in everything I do. Otherwise, no, it doesn't work for me. I need to be an optimist.
Mhm. Okay, I like to hear it. I wanna shift gears a little bit into Berlin, because I think I mean, most of my audience is immigrants or
Yes.
people who have moved to Berlin, or Germany in general. So I wanna talk a little bit more about just how many, because obviously Germany needs workers, and so that's why there's this big push to get a lot of skilled migration happening in Germany. And there's just so many people that pay taxes here but can't vote in any German
Yeah.
election. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I mean, my personal opinion is clear. I would like to give people the vote based on where they live long term, where they pay taxes, where they raise their kids. That's a principle that I think fits this world, because the passport or the nationality, it was once the most important thing, but increasingly it's not anymore. Increasingly, people, yeah, they have a Brazilian. My neighbors have a Brazilian passport, but they're in Berlin longer than me. There's various reasons why people, cannot get German citizenship, or why they might not want to, including, yeah, their home country doesn't allow dual citizenship, or even worse, their home country doesn't allow, giving up citizenship, at all. They think it's tied to ethnicity and to birth, and that's it. And in my opinion, it's weird to live 20 years somewhere and not be allowed to participate. That said, for people to get the vote, this will be like a long process. The German constitution and laws are super clear that only nationals are allowed to vote. And we had to sort of grudgingly accept that somewhere buried in the EU treaties, it says, well, other EU citizens are allowed to vote on the local level. And that's maybe important for your listeners. If you're a member of an EU country, you can vote in Berlin elections on 20th of September, but only for the local level, so for the 12 districts, not for the
Mhm.
state of Berlin. I
Yeah,
think people who have a permanent residency here, pay taxes and so on, should be able to vote on the state level and even on the federal level. But that would be a long-term thing. That would be changing the federal law or maybe even the constitution.
definitely. And I think Berlin in general is quite an interesting use case because I think last year I read it was like 160,000 people left Berlin, but the city's still growing. It's just growing more internationally. And I do think there is some fear that if you start letting all the immigrants vote, myself included, like we vote for our own interests as well.
Yeah,
So how do you
good,
kind of recommend that
good, good.
as
Good question. Is there this fear? I mean, it's definitely written about, but I think nobody thinks, or I don't know anybody who thinks deeply about this participation and voting. It's more or less people frame it more culturally. What about these refugees? What about a million Arabs who might have very different values? That's more what I read and what I hear about. Partly, it might be true. Okay, people who have who grew up in a very patriarchal society. What do they know about equal rights and so on? But here comes the sort of positive optimist again. People are learning. Why do you tell people just because you're born somewhere you cannot change your opinion, you cannot change your mind? I mean, the whole idea of democracy is sort of debate and changing someone's mind via debate.
Mhm.
As for as I don't think in politics there somebody you know plots to keep the Americans out. I think we're not on that level. What I will say though is votes for parliament is not the only way to get involved. Like there's so many levels where you can get involved. It starts with you know going to a sports club regularly and taking over a weekly class there or something. There are so many NGOs where you can help and where you can even get into like a CXO position. I mean, most NGOs also have a management board. And in Germany, there's this participatory thing in big companies. So there's work councils, and you can also get elected on those. Yeah, I think you don't need to be a German for that. You just need to be a resident and work at that company. So there are many many levels where you can get involved. Democracy is much more than parliamentary elections.
Certainly. As far as with kind of the influx of so many immigrants, do you think that more city services should be offered in English? And then, well, I'll stop there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good question. It would be great, honestly. The question is, how do you get there? The Berlin.de website is not that bad. You can actually at least have the website and a lot of the explanations translated, and not only into English, but there's also, I don't know, Turkish, Arabic, Ukrainian. There's several languages on how to inform yourself. That's not the biggest hurdle. I think some processes are too complicated, and that's the difficulty. Some things you don't understand. You have various blogs and podcasts explaining stuff to you, because if you just read what's on the government website, you still don't understand. And then the trickiest part is people. Yeah. So people get frustrated when there's like a special case. Their papers are gummed up, some things not working. They want to get someone on the phone to talk. And then, if you have a special case, which is not standard, what is the chance that you get someone English speaking on the line who also knows how to fix this very specific special case? That will be the trick. When I'm visiting these public offices, how many of these people are really kind of willing to learn English to such an extent, yeah, to get that done. So I'm a little bit skeptical of offering, every single thing in every special case. What I do think, though, we can make some of the, 10 most standard things much more available, and it can be some citizen focused, like changing your address, but especially some company focused. I mean, when we hired some people from Lebanon in the company where I worked, like we had to have a sort of consulting company who helped us with this. Like it was almost impossible for ourselves to get the papers right. And that could be a government function. Hey, we know we need immigrants. We know we have certain, in this case it was software engineers, but I think there's also something in hospital workers and so on. Let's have a government agency that can help with that specific sort of pain point of helping immigrants with their papers. That's something we could offer in English or in Vietnamese or in whatever is needed.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question because on one hand, I think actually learning the language of the country you've moved to is incredibly important to integration. And my hot take is I really do judge people who don't bother to learn German. Like that is a huge like red flag
Yeah.
negative for me when I meet someone who's been here for 5 years and they're at like A1 German. I'm like, what are you doing? But on the other hand, I do agree that yeah, when trying to recruit like this many immigrants to fill these roles, it does kind of add a layer of complexity for them.
Yeah.
So
And by the way, it's not the language level. Yeah. I mean, if when I had to do some of the bureaucratic stuff for the first time, I had to Google. I had to go to various sources to find out what I need to do. Just because I'm a native speaker doesn't mean I'm understanding all the forms that are presented to me. That's another layer of complexity. Administration can be complex. It's not only a language thing. It's also our duty to make it easier and maybe to have simple explanations. Maybe to have a yes, for legal reasons you need to have this quote on the back of some paper. What are your rights into this? But maybe give people a 5-point summary. What's the most important thing?
So then my question for you, and it might be, the Volt's idea of what is the most important thing or your idea of what's the most important thing, but what would you change first? You mentioned like, okay, maybe we choose the top 10 things that are really difficult to navigate. What are those things that affect people's lives?
Good question. I mean, in Berlin, honestly, they are just some things in the public administration are just dysfunctional. The law, there was a Verwaltungsreform, so reform of public administration. The law was passed, I think, half a year ago, like exactly in January or something. But the details have not been passed, and the details basically say, which things are really done by the districts and which things are really done by the state level. And I was when I heard it's not. It's not even defined yet what is done by the districts, what is done by the state level. And that's one of the reasons why things were so slow in Berlin, because things are going in circles. So it has nothing to do with translating. It has nothing to do with digitalization. It first has something to do with like getting the basics right. In some other states, it's clear what the state of Bavaria is responsible for and what the city of Munich is responsible for. It's clearly defined and written down. Berlin has not done it so far. So that's, some background stuff that we have to do first. It's underway, but I'm not sure when they will be done with this. The second thing is you need to empower people. It's a myth that people who work in this sort of public administration are lazy. They're oftentimes hamstrung because they have, there are not enough people. They're maybe not the best people, especially in Berlin. It's an issue that people who work in the federal government agencies earn much more than who work on the state of Berlin. But it's kind of the same pool of people who apply. Yeah? So the city or the state of Berlin consistently is left with maybe less capable people than maybe than they could have, because they pay so much less than the federal level. And the third thing is then the tools that they have and so on. When you look at the computers, when you look at the stuff, some stuff is working. Yes, I got my fingerprints and I got my photograph taken for a new passport, and that was kind of easy. But in other areas, you have this huge, backlog of IT where basically you have to fill in your form. Maybe you can fill in your PDF, on a screen, but then you have to print it, and then the poor lady there has to type it into a computer again, because she doesn't even have a scanner. That sort of inefficiency is not a people thing; it's a tech thing. It can be solved. A lot of cities are working on it, from Kiel and Hamburg and Frankfurt, the German cities, but also Estonia is good with this once only principle. Yeah, you have you give your data to the government once, and then you allow them to cross-reference, and then when you apply for whatever social benefit, they know what your salary is because you have submitted your taxes already, and they can look it up there, and you don't have to and fill your current earnings again in a paper form. And that is stuff that's possible. It's not crazy. For various reasons, Berlin has been a little bit behind, but it's solvable. We can make a huge progress in incentivizing people, right? Solving some technical stuff and solving some of this mess of responsibilities. Some of that can be done within 5 years of the next parliamentary term.
Do you think there are any specific, because obviously Germany as a whole, there have been those agreements that it will be digitalized, but it's just not moving very quickly. Do you think there are some cities that are doing it better than others, and kind of what can be learned there?
Yeah, I think you can learn. I think there's a best practice in Vienna, which is not Germany, but who have some sort of, for many years, some continuous improvement programs, and really listen deeply within the people who work in the administration. What to do and what to improve, and how to improve their own processes, not political priorities, but their daily work. Yeah, I think in both Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, where Volt is, a tiny part of the coalition, like with 5% or something, they did a push for digitalization, and they went, as simple as going to the marketplace and letting people on a Sunday just renew their driving license, and instead of getting an appointment somewhere between 9 and 3 during the work week. And they have started to digitalize more of the services, because surprisingly many services are on the city level in Germany. Only a few things are really on the federal level. And if you have the German residency as a sort of worker or the passport, by now you have to log in with your card. Maybe I'll cover my number or something, but that's my card. And with this
Okay.
little identity card, you can log in into a surprising amount of government services. Most people don't know it, yeah. But that's sort of one national infrastructure that is already there, and then now it's on the cities to sort of use that and make it accessible to with their services.
I do have to say, setting up, because I set up my card as well, and I think mine's
Yeah,
a little
it's
different because
clumsy,
it's,
yeah.
yeah, but it took me forever to get it set up. But then once I finally got it set up, now logging into everything is like 1,000 times easier. So
Exactly.
if
So we're
anyone out
working on
there,
it, but we make everything extra secure and extra layer of data protection and so on. Yeah.
oh my gosh, yeah, nobody's stealing anything from that. It's like 7 layers of sign in. But yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting call out though, that a lot of the digitalization is needs to be happening at kind of the local level. And so kind of when we talk about these efficiencies, local politics does almost become more important than federal. politics.
Yeah, for some topics, and for where you're close to it. I mean, which school is funded how, which street is repaired. Of course, the national level has a role to play I think especially the EU level has a role to play in foreign policy. It will make a difference if Europe negotiates with China or Germany negotiates with China. Yeah? But lots of stuff that affect us are actually decided on the local level. True.
Definitely. Speaking of the local level, I think everyone agrees the biggest, well, not everyone, but most people agree that the biggest problem in Berlin is the housing crisis.
Yes.
I know one popular kind of criticism of Volt is that the party opposes rent caps. So I'm curious, kind of what is, and correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's what I saw in my reading. So that's always kind of why I've been a little skeptical. But I definitely don't think rent caps are a total solution to housing, but especially in Berlin where that issue is so widely important. I'm curious, what is your stance on housing
Yeah.
and how do we fix it?
Yeah.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare here.
Yeah, we'll have a lot in the program which should be published soon. It's multifactorial, yeah. So meaning there's many things we need to fix. Maybe only a few sentences on why rent caps are not the only solution, and then what could be a solution. In Germany, you have a regulation. First of all, you have something against extortion, and there are laws against extortion. The problem is people don't sue their landlord, even though they could. Rarely anything goes to court for extortion. The second is there's a national level rent break, I think is the translation, Mietpreisbremse. And I
Yep.
think we think this should stay in place. It has several kind of good measures of when you rent out an apartment newly, it can only be, above 10% above some local average. And here is how cities need to calculate the local average. And that helps with crazy price spikes in a way. What doesn't help is that nobody's checking it. You also have to sue your landlord again. But if you do it, there are services that help you. There are many lawyers that help you. But that is a tried and tested way. If something is really wrong, you can check rent cap, Google it, or Mietpreisbremse, and you can get a reduction there. Berlin had this very special case that they wanted to introduce like another thing on top, and on top of all the federal regulation, they wanted to have another layer and just like literally force people in current contracts to cap rents. That happened. I had a lot of work in my startup of it because I had to execute it for hundreds of apartments. And then a year and a half later or something, I had to roll it back because the constitutional court said, we don't even talk about the content. You are not competent to do that. There's a national law on rent caps, and there's a role for the cities to play, namely, how you get the data and how you calculate this appropriate rents on a local level. And therefore, it's done. You can't put something on top of it. So the court didn't even look into the content. But I can tell you from what I saw personally that the content was also stupid because people who were living in the middle of Prenzlauer Berg in a 100 square meter Altbau beautiful apartment and lawyers suddenly instead of 1,500 rent they had to pay 500 because the Berlin law said, oh, it's mostly based on the year of construction. Oh, this was constructed in 1890, therefore it can only be €5.90 per square meter or whatever. So in the end, it helped people who are already rich, at least partly, and not those who are looking for an apartment or those families who are living in the high rise already somewhere in Marzahn. So it was like really done in a stupid way, the Berlin thing.
I do want to pause too because I think what's so interesting about that, just that whole debacle of Berlin being like, we're changing the law, and then the federal government being like, you can't do that, is that in kind of I guess I'm reading more in like leftist spaces, like kind of
Yes.
it was very much like, the nerve of the federal government to cut this. It was such a wonderful thing, and I never, I guess maybe this is me being too negative again. I don't think there is ever like one wonderful thing. There's no silver bullet that's going to fix
No,
the
of course
issue.
not.
But I do think that one specifically, kind of the media narrative around it was just so this was a wonderful thing that we were doing for people, and now the federal government said that we can't. And so I do find it really interesting because I was interviewed in a BBC article
Yeah.
recently talking about the rent caps, and I was so annoyed because they misquoted me and then like changed what I said to like fit some narrative where I was like, I'm against rent caps. And I was like, I didn't say that. I'm not against rent caps. But I do think, yeah, how they were executed in Berlin was, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely
It it
more
it
nuanced
it
than,
didn't help those people who needed the help, let's say.
yeah.
Leads to weird things. You remember there's a Seinfeld episode where somebody dies and everybody wants to get that apartment, and like 10 people are vying for the same rent controlled apartment in New York. Yeah. It can lead to the fact, yeah, who has connections gets it and not who actually needs the support, you know? So maybe let's shift to like what can be done about the housing situation and who actually needs support.
Mhm.
When you think about Berlin, there's a consistent sort of mismatch of supply and demand. And that's mostly because everybody's moving here, but not enough buildings are built. And then there's a second thing about, you know, social housing and, you know, what about people with low income? That's, I'll come to that. The main thing about building is, you know, it's expensive to build and you depend on the government. And the government literally, you know, made a plan. We need so and so many buildings, and we have like certain city districts where there should be building and so on. But then just getting the right to build, like getting the permit can take years and years and years, and can be, you know, frustrated by somebody alleges there was a frog there. That's one of the things. It can be quicker. Yeah, of course, you should respect everyone's right, but it's possible to decide within 3 or 4 years if somewhere can be built. You know, taking 8 or 9 years and just letting things pile up. Yeah? Or maybe only a second example on you know quick building or cheaper building. If you have new buildings, they're quite expensive. Oftentimes, because of investors want to make a profit, but oftentimes also because they're like super high standard. And Hamburg has tackled this. They have introduced a so-called Hamburg standard that says, you know, you can have slightly less noise protection and not the newest materials, you know, and your ceilings can be, you know, a little bit lower and so on. And that's how we can build more sort of affordable housing. And Berlin decided not to copy this. Yeah, the Berlin decided to form an expert group to make their new own Berlin standard, and that will take another 2 years. Instead of saying, "Wow, Hamburg is so similar in climate, in circumstances, social circumstances, density, materials are available, you know, if we're in the same country, so maybe we can just take the Hamburg standard and, you know, adjust it a little bit. No, we're doing our own Berlin standard, and affordable building will take another 2 or 3 years, yeah? And until it's passed. It's crazy. And then there's many things that the cities can do. I'm not an expert on this, but there's a couple of things it will be in our program. For example, the cities they can dedicate a piece of land somehow sort of non-profit and say, hey, we give it for 99 years to a non-profit to build their social housing, as opposed to selling the land and having a private investor like own it forever outright. Baurecht. So there's a lot of things about how the city can free up brownfield. There was a factory there, but let's dedicate that to living, and let's give it sort of for non-profit building. And that brings me sort of to the last point. A lot of, you know, people with low incomes cannot find a flat in Berlin, and only building new sort of high-end homes will not solve that. And that's basically because until like maybe 15 years ago, the government built social housing, and it was always like, yeah, you have to have this sort of rent-controlled flats for like 30 years. But once those 30 years are over, you know, it's free on the market. And then they stopped doing this. They stopped building. And now more and more flats are sort of out of this pool of social housing. The pool shrinks every year. And if we're really taking it seriously, then we probably need a huge public building program, and money should be put into new social housing programs to build more affordable homes and to make them, you know, controlled for another 30 years or maybe even forever. There's a credible calculations. If you have sort of a mixed quarter, you know, you need to say 30% of the flats will be social housing forever. Don't create ghettos, but keep these sort of units long-term in that pool. I hope these are some ideas. For more, we have several architects and, you know, economists and so on in the party. There will be more about it in the program.
Definitely. No, it's such a nuanced issue, and yeah, I'm interested to see how it'll go in the upcoming years. But yeah, definitely, I think that's the biggest one in Berlin, and it's also hard because I think any politician that comes in isn't. I mean, it's impossible to fix within, you know, let's say it's the most efficient process possible. It'll take like still probably a couple years to like start to see like some sort
Yeah.
of impact from any changes.
You still have levers. You can give, you know, cheap financing necessity or guarantees. You can give away some of the land. One thing your listeners can also Google about is crazy. There are so many empty office spaces in Berlin, and there are some startups, nonprofits who say, hey, they could be transformed into at least temporary living spaces, maybe student apartments. You know, and if the economy changes and we need factories again, great, they can become offices or factories again. So far, the government is blocking this and saying, well, no, it's a multi-year process to like say this is not an office, this is now a living quarter anymore. Even if it's technically doable with water and electricity and fire protection, even if it's technically doable, the government at the moment says, no, let's rather have like empty offices than make student apartments out of it. Yeah. And that's something that it's complicated, but it's doable. And it's in the power of state level government to do that.
I think that one's really interesting because yeah, I had a friend who she owns a shop, like a brick and mortar store, and she was looking for a space and she found this one space that had like an upstairs, and she was like, "This is amazing! I could like live up here and then have my shop downstairs. I could host events. It would be really
Uh,
great."
uh,
It was like the perfect space, and then, yeah, no amount of regulation was gonna let her live there, and I was like, "Man, that's just like" it was such a shame because it was such a perfect solution for her. But yeah, always a regulatory issue.
It's in our power to change. And I don't need to be a mayor of Berlin to change that. Ideas that make sense, you can propose them, and it's been many times something proposed by a smaller party or by a newcomer has been quietly adopted by the bigger parties because they say, well, it actually makes sense. Okay, let's change the name, let's change two clauses, and let's say we invented it, and then it will still help all the people.
I do wanna kinda piggyback on that though, because Volt is one of the smaller parties, especially here in Germany, and so Volt got, I think, around 2% last time in the vote. What is the realistic goal for September for Volt and for yourself? I saw, just before the podcast, I think your list place 13, so,
Yes.
maybe explain a little bit how that works, like, if it
Yeah.
yeah, like how many people actually get to like serve in the government if there's, a certain amount of
Yeah.
votes that are given.
Yeah, as you know, we elect parliament and then they form the government. Parliament will have probably around 150 seats. We don't know exactly. Like the law says 120, but then there's this complicated things of local candidates versus list candidates. Currently, it has, I think, 158 or 159 something. So we're
Mhm.
expecting around 150 people in state parliament. That means 10% would mean I'm for sure in. Is that realistic? I don't know. Our goal is to affect positive change. For that, we need to be in. So getting in with 5% is this sort of magic threshold. That's the minimum goal. My personal goal is to get in as well. Yes, I don't want to sit on the sidelines. I actually want to sit on the table and decide. So my personal goal is 10% for the party Berlin-wide. Is this realistic? We have to present our program and we have to talk to people. The high point was the European elections in 2024, where across Germany we had like 2.8, 2.9% or something, but we had 4.8% in Berlin. And that meant in the end, we have 5 people in the European Parliament, 2 from Netherlands, 3 from Germany. So we are there. These guys are working. They worked on quite important initiatives. And now it's our sort of term or our task to convince people that Volt can also have good ideas for local government. And if you think about, these people, if each of them convinces just, one votes for us again and convinces one family member, then suddenly we're not at 4.8, but at 9 or 10%. So it's definitely possible. We have to convince the Berliners that we're not only the Europe party, but that we have good ideas for Berlin.
Definitely. I'm curious kind of how you see Volt as differentiating themselves from the Greens, or I've even heard people on the left kind of called Volt I don't agree with this, the purple FDP.
Yeah.
But I guess how do you, because I think one of the biggest differentiators is that European stance, but that isn't necessarily like a plus point for people who are looking at like very hyper local Berlin
Yeah,
issues. It's
true.
not a negative either. It's just
Yeah,
not related.
absolutely
Yeah.
true. Yeah. I mean, yes, I think if you honestly want to put it in this ideological spectrum, it would be social liberal. So yeah, some market-based solutions, some state and regulatory-based solutions, and that's why some people say, "Oh, you're too much like the Greens," and the others say you're too much like the Liberal Democrats, FDP. For me, that's the sweet spot. That's exactly where I want to be. Now, how do we differentiate? It's easier to say how do we differentiate from the liberals? Yeah, basically they gave up this meaning of liberal. Like for me, liberal means increasing everybody's freedom. And that means oftentimes people who are less privileged today. Yeah, we have to think about people who can't afford an apartment and so on. And this German Liberal Party, and unfortunately, is going this libertarian way, like Millet and so on. And like the state is bad, let's destroy the state. And only people who drive a Porsche fast are the hardworking guys in this country. So I think they went nuts, and that's why they were kicked out of the federal parliament. They also were kicked out of the Berlin state parliament. They don't have a good proposition, in my opinion. Yeah. How are we different from the Greens? I personally have voted for the Greens before in some national elections before I became a Volt member, and there are some sensible people. Cem Özdemir, the prime minister of the state of Baden-Württemberg, is one of them. Unfortunately, there's a large part, and especially strong in Berlin, who are kind of against compromises and against anything in the middle, who try to be more left than the sort of left-wing party or the sort of former communist party, who openly say, no, we need to expropriate companies, and that will solve everything. And I don't think personally that expropriating companies will solve the housing crisis or will solve anything. So the Berlin Greens, they're super left. They're much less willing to compromise than in other states. And my pitch is, look at our program. There will be sensible solutions in the Volt program, and these could be achieved with a sort of left-ish coalition of SPD and Greens, but they could also be proposed to a more center-right-ish coalition with a CDU, so Conservative Party and SPD. Yeah, we could work with both, while the Greens at the moment, at least in Berlin, try to say we're more left than the left party.
I think it's so hard, and something that's just really interesting to me about German politics because, and I'm not affiliated with any party,
Yeah,
but I do think that especially leftists, they have like a very specific idea of what they want. But then, let's say that's like 5% of the general population. And so that group of people can't get everything that they want, but then there's no room for compromise. And the
yeah,
whole way German politics is designed is that you have to compromise. But then if you compromise too much, the people who voted for you will start
yeah.
to dislike you. And so it's kind of this like balancing act constantly that
It's
that I
it's
see.
tough. Yeah. What I read a book. I don't want to promote somebody else's book, but I got an important thought in the last couple of weeks, and that was, when you build a coalition, try to identify those things. The coalition is usually just for one term between parties in parliament. So let's say for 5 years in the case of Berlin. Try to identify those topics where you want to work on a solution together, and already sort of the direction. And then that's where the compromising needs to happen. And then define a few topics where your ideological views are so fundamentally different, and you just agree to be different. And these are like 3, 4 topics that you will not tackle during this coalition. Try to work on these things together that you think you can work on together, and then it's okay. On the national level, that sometimes conservatives work with sort of central left SPD, and sometimes they work with Greens, and yeah, some topics only get solved the next time. At least a thought that I took with me. You can't compromise on everything, then it will be a mushy middle. So let's rather identify what we want to solve, work on that, postpone a few other things.
Mhm. So it is kind of a focus on individual policies over like a, you've mentioned the wider vision as well. But I guess what you're saying right now is that for coalition politics, you have to focus on individual policies that you want to change.
Yeah, and then in the next election, voters can decide, hey, did my ideology somehow change? Do I want to push, for more of that or more of that? But voters can also judge, okay, they promised to work on these few selected problems. Did they actually do that? They can judge both. Better than trying to compromise on literally every single thing.
Mhm. So do you think we should measure either a party's success or politician's success on did they do the things that they said they were going to do, or should we measure it based on did they stay true to a set of values?
Good point. I mean, I strongly believe in values, but a lot of people package, specific policies and say that's my value. Expropriation is not a value. Lower taxes are not a value. A value is something like, okay, you know, every human has dignity. A value is, I try to speak the truth. Let's not people make this mistake to put everything above discussion or everything that's my core value. What should we measure politicians on? I think partly on truth, not necessarily on what they said during the electioneering, because that's when you have to differentiate. So if we measure them against something, then we should measure them against this sort of coalition agreement that it's very typical in Germany to sort of write down and after an election and before sort of the term starts. We also might measure them against sort of a plan they lay out. Oftentimes somebody lays out, a 1-year plan or 2-year plan that they want to fix in their first 100 days or whatever. What they actually say, we can measure them against that. And then lastly, we can measure against sort of a few KPIs. I don't want to make politics, into a business where everything is money driven, but people can give themselves a KPI like, okay, we want, now we know X% of kids are finishing school without any graduation, in 5 years, we want to halve that number. And then the sort of policies behind can be, do we need to hire more teachers? Or actually we have enough teachers? Do we need more social workers who work together with the kids and the parents in the afternoon? Or do we need to make classes smaller? Do we need to change the curriculum? Many things that can be done. But, what is our KPI? Okay, fewer kids should leave school just without any kind of graduation. And that's another thing that a government could say is one of our KPIs. The trick is not to give yourself, 100 of those. Then nothing is important. Give yourself a few of those.
Right. And I think it's hard to choose kind of what are those most important things. And I guess I do see certainly in US politics, but also I think with people I talk to here in Germany, there's like this, I guess certain people see the left as like, having higher values, like they care about like, dignity of people or, and I reject this concept that, yeah, in order to be like a valued or principled person, you need to be on one side of the political
Mhm.
spectrum. But I do think that, yeah, values have kind of become this like intertwined aspect of what political party you support. And there certainly are parties that, I don't think respect the dignity of
Oh,
humanity.
absolutely. There's a lot of craziness. I mean, we can say there's a right wing party called AfD in Germany, and both their program is nuts and their people are nuts. And there's enough publicly documented sort of hate speech where they want to kick out 20% of the population if they could. And they say, yeah, if you have a German passport, you're not German. I'll look you in the face and I'll decide by the color of your skin if you're German or by your parents or grandparents' heritage. And that's crazy. And these are values that are not shared. But if you sort of stay within the democratic spectrum, you can still say different values can still lead to like good policy. I remember that years ago, decades ago, when I was young, there was a debate about how much protection of the natural environment and how should we limit climate change and so on. At that time, the Greens, of course, were pushing it. Hey, that's there's a catastrophe coming. The trees are dying, the earth is warming, and so on. And the Conservative Party was the one in power, and they nicely kind of in the end pushed similar policies by saying, oh, let's protect God's creation. We come from different values. We're not coming from this like bottom up grassroots and tree hugging. We're coming from let's protect God's creation for our children to enjoy. They had a different framing of values to come to the same conclusion. Let's support the Kyoto Protocol and the limiting of climate change. Yeah, and the same thing again when it came to the rights of gay people. For a long time they were kind of in a legal limbo. It's not really criminal anymore, but they also don't have the right to marry and so on. Again, under Merkel, she somehow pushed it through the Conservative Party to say, people are made how God made them. Let's have them the same freedom as everyone. It's not their fault, sort of. Not what I would have said. I would have said it's absolutely normal. It's not of your business what's happening in somebody's bedroom. We know about gay animals. It was wrong 50 years ago to deny them rights. It was wrong 100 years ago to deny them rights, and it's wrong today. But at least the Conservative Party came around and said, yeah, we're all creation of God. How can we judge God for making him gay? Okay, let's give him the rights. That's amazing. You
Yeah.
you can have common ground even if you come from different perspectives.
I mean, I think that's a really important point, just in general, because I do think there is this tendency to be like, yeah, anyone who supports the AfD is crazy or dumb or racist, and I don't think that that's necessarily helpful because they are polling right now at 28%. And so, if we look at
Thankfully, not in
democracy,
Berlin, but
no, not in
nationally,
Berlin,
yeah.
but nationally, and that's, that is concerning. But like when you peel back those layers, I do think that those people at the end of the day, they have the same concerns that the people on the left have. They're scared about economic uncertainty. They're scared about like,
Yes.
what job they're gonna have, how they're gonna pay rent. There's at
A
the end of
lot
the
of
day,
it. Exactly. A lot of it is sort of scared about economics. Some is a little bit blaming what you don't know. Let's blame foreigners. It's easier to blame them when they're not my neighbor. It's harder when you live in the city and you interact with them in the supermarket every day. And one part is this sort of frustration with the incumbents and saying, oh yeah, we had Conservative Party for 20 years. I didn't like it. We had the sort of center left SPD for 20 years. I didn't like it. Let's try someone else. I didn't even read the program. Let's just try someone else. That's also in the mix. And then I always have to reply, okay, if you want to try someone else, you don't have to read a 100-page program, but at least read like a summary. The AfD with kicking out the people who work in our hospitals, lowering taxes for the rich, and destroying nature. Like how exactly will your life become better? The paradox that their program will hurt their own voters the most.
Mhm.
And it's partly explainable by people don't read programs. People say, yeah, let's give someone else to try. I don't think they're a real alternative. I think it will be for the worse if they are in power.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's in general. I don't think people read programs. I don't think that they don't really care about like what specifically policy is going to be changed. I think people just care about like how does someone make them feel? Do I feel any sort of like sense of confidence in this person, in this party, in this idea? Are my neighbors doing it? And sometimes that's good and sometimes that is not great.
Yeah, tough crick. Now, if I knew how to, how to battle the AfD, I would do it. There has been definitely the trying of the sort of the center right to imitate their policies, and it has not helped. People who say, yeah, we're also getting rid of migrants, but we'll have an orderly process. Well, that didn't convince people. At the same time, on the left, demonizing and saying, okay, you're beyond the pale. Now you're a Nazi. Now you're out of the spectrum. I won't talk to you again. Obviously, didn't also help. If I had the solution, I would say so here. I don't have it. What I will say is I want to be a credible alternative. Yeah. Berlin politics is slow, especially in Berlin. There's some of the incumbents have become fat and lazy. That's the natural turn of events. So it's time to, change the government a little bit and have at least a volt participation with 10%. And then we can at least contribute a little bit to changing the course of Berlin. Let's not elect someone who wants to destroy. Let's elect someone who wants to improve.
I think that's yeah, a perfect summary. Awesome. Well, as we're kind of closing in on an hour, I want to make sure that I give you any space to. Is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you were like, man, I was hoping we were going to talk about that, or any specific topic that I missed?
Good point. Maybe not policy wise, we could talk policy forever. Whoever is interested, please go to the World website and check our program. Maybe one note to your listeners, you can vote on the local level. Maybe we said in the beginning, but if you're a European national on 20th of September, you can vote on the local level for the parliaments of these 12 districts within Berlin. Please use your right. It's the first step and it only takes, half an hour to go there and make your cross.
Definitely. And if you've already done your Anmeldung, then the registration is just sent to you by the end of August. I believe everyone should have received it.
That's true. You don't have to register to be in the voter roll. You just have to register your flat where you live. True.
Which you should have done anyway, technically.
Exactly.
Perfect. And then my final question then is, I guess, what message do you have to the people who live in Berlin and can't vote? What should they know?
What should they know? Democracy is much more than parliamentary elections. Please get involved in whatever suits your interest, be it a neighborhood initiative to clean up the trash, be it, becoming a trainer, a coach in a local sports club, or maybe working with unions. Get involved. There's much more opportunities to get involved than just sort of work and political parties.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you for being here. This was a wonderful chat.
Thank you.